After half a century of absolute silence, Ron Howard has finally decided to expose the secret that almost destroyed his life and that Hollywood tried to bury for decades. A story filled with extreme pressure, traumatic decisions, behind-the-scenes manipulation, and an episode so dark that many believe that, had it come to light earlier, it would have ended his career forever. Today we will reveal every detail of this unsettling truth that Howard kept locked away, including the most controversial moments that marked his journey and that the public never imagined. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and leave your like, because it tells YouTube that this content deserves to be recommended to more people and helps the channel keep producing videos like this. If you can support even more, use Super Thanks, and if you can't, just comment on what surprised you the most. And stay until the end, because the final revelation is going to leave you completely shocked.
Welcome back to The Late Show, Ron Howard. So good to see you guys.
From a very early age, Ron Howard's childhood stopped being just childhood and turned into a territory of responsibilities, expectations, and routines that no child should ever carry. He grew up surrounded by cameras, film sets, and adults who treated his talent as something precious, but who, without realizing it, placed him under silent and constant pressure. While other children spent their days running around backyards and inventing games, Ron was learning lines, repeating scenes to the point of exhaustion, and behaving like a professional, even before he understood what it meant to be one. The artistic environment at home, with actor parents, awakened in him both admiration and a sense of inevitability. It was as if his destiny had been written even before he learned to write his own name. He became a figure adored by the public while still very young, but behind the sweetness and the shy smile was a boy trying to understand why his life was so different from that of other children. The early responsibilities, the long recording hours, and the constant expectation to be flawless shaped his sense of discipline, but they also created an emotional weight he would only truly recognize decades later. The line between work and play simply did not exist. Everything was work, and Ron ended up learning, at a very young age, to hide exhaustion, frustrations, and even fears, because he believed that disappointing someone was not an option. This kind of forced maturity made him develop a deep sensitivity and a sharp perception of the adult world, but it also left him vulnerable to insecurities that would silently follow him through much of his life. Thus, Ron Howard's childhood became a curious mixture of dream and pressure, brightness and demands, affection and obligations, an experience that shaped his talent and work ethic, but also planted in his heart the need to prove, every single day, that he deserved to be there. So much so that already in his teenage years, Ron Howard went through one of the most delicate and decisive periods of his life, a moment when the constant pressure of fame almost made him leave Hollywood for good. While the world saw him as the charismatic young star of Happy Days, he carried inside him an emotional exhaustion that few could imagine. The transition from childhood to adolescence is already challenging on its own, but for Ron, everything was amplified by the responsibility of maintaining a perfect career, pleasing fans, directors, and studios, and never showing fragility. He began to feel the weight of being recognized everywhere, of having every gesture evaluated, every word interpreted, and of living within a standard of perfection that seemed impossible to sustain. At the same time, a genuine desire emerged in him to explore who was outside the screen, something his tightly controlled schedule made completely impossible. In several interviews, Ron admitted that this phase was marked by deep insecurities and the constant fear of disappointing people he didn't even know. There came a point when he felt trapped inside his own public image, as if he were a character included in real life. It was during this period that he considered abandoning everything, simply disappearing from the industry and seeking a simpler, more anonymous life. The pressure from studios for results, the scrutiny over his appearance and behavior, and the lack of emotional space to make mistakes made him question whether he truly wanted to continue living that way. But paradoxically, it was exactly this conflict that led him to discover a new passion, directing. Upon realizing that he could create stories rather than just interpret them, Howard found a new meaning for his career. Directing became an escape valve, a path that offered him control, creativity, and for the first time, the feeling that he was building something that was truly his. Even so, the teenager who almost abandoned Hollywood carried the marks of that turbulent phase for years, always remembering that behind the spotlight, there is a human being trying to find his place in the world. However, Ron Howard quickly discovered that talent alone was not enough to survive in Hollywood. It was necessary to navigate a labyrinth of rigid contracts, commercial expectations, powerful egos, and partnerships that could either elevate or destroy an entire career. Although his face was known by millions, many executives still saw him only as the child prodigy from television, not as a filmmaker capable of leading ambitious productions. This initial disbelief marked his journey deeply, forcing him to fight to prove his worth and secure creative space in a system where few were granted a voice. The early negotiations were tough. On many occasions, Ron watched projects he loved get shelved by executives who didn't believe in his vision or wanted to turn them into something entirely different. He learned early that, in Hollywood, every contract carries a silent battle between what the artist wants and what the studio wants to sell. In many of these agreements, Howard had to make painful concessions to see his films come to life, accepting cuts, casting changes, and direct interference in the script. This reality taught him that creativity has a price, and that it isn't always a fair one. Still, it was within this competitive environment that he built some of the most important partnerships of his life. His collaboration with Brian Grazer, for example, redefined his career. Together, they founded Imagine Entertainment, a production company that would become responsible for some of the most influential films and series of recent decades.
That was my mom delivering that line.
That was your mom?
Yes, yes.
Oh my God, now I'm going to cry.
But before the success, they endured countless tense meetings, funding rejections, and executives who didn't take the duo seriously. Persistence, however, turned that partnership into one of the longest-lasting in the industry. His relationship with George Lucas also deeply shaped his path. After starring in American Graffiti, Howard found in Lucas someone who believed in his potential as a director, something essential for Ron to seriously venture behind the camera. Lucas supported him, advised him, and opened doors that otherwise would have remained closed. However, the partnership also came with enormous expectations, and Ron knew that every project needed to deliver results if he wanted to keep his reputation intact. With Tom Hanks, the creative connection became almost automatic. Working together on Splash, Apollo 13, and the Da Vinci Code, they developed a synergy in which trust and professionalism blended naturally with friendship. But even this widely celebrated partnership faced delicate moments when external pressures, criticism, nervous studios, exaggerated expectations threatened to turn films into backstage battles. For Ron, every contract represented a negotiation between his dreams and the reality imposed by the industry. On some projects like Willow and the Da Vinci Code, he had to defend his vision with firmness, facing tense meetings in which producers demanded changes to make the films more commercial. In those moments, creativity seemed constantly threatened, and Ron had to choose between compromising to keep the production alive or fighting to preserve the essence of the story. This ongoing tension drained him emotionally, because even after decades in command, he still had to prove his worth. Another defining point was his lesson in leadership. Directing big-budget films meant commanding hundreds of people, each with their own needs and expectations. Ron discovered that partnerships don't happen only at the top of the industry, but also in the details, in the trust built with the cinematographer, in the respect for the writer's work, in the communication with the cast, and in the careful creation of an environment where everyone could contribute creatively. Despite the challenges, he always tried to cultivate a collaborative atmosphere, believing that a film's final quality depends as much on the major decisions as on the small alliances built day by day. Over the years, Howard learned that the true strength of partnerships lies not just in signed contracts, but in the ability to find people who understand, respect, and believe in his artistic vision. Ron Howard always tried to protect his personality with almost obsessive care, precisely because he knew how turbulent, invasive, and relentless Hollywood could be. Behind the dedicated director and the actor beloved by the public, there was a man searching, often desperately, for a balance between career, family, and identity, a balance he nearly lost at several moments in his life. His marriage to Cheryl Alley, which began in 1975, is often cited as one of the most solid in the industry, but that doesn't mean it was easy. On the contrary, it was this union that became the pillar holding him up during the most chaotic periods of his life, especially when work began consuming every available minute and fame turned even simple activities into something exhausting. Cheryl met Ron before he became the giant name he is today, before the interviews, the constant travel, and the pressure of leading multi-million-dollar productions. This allowed her to see the man behind the public figure, and that deep bond was essential for facing the toughest phases together. Even with that strong love, there were times when Ron found himself away from home for months, trapped in film sets, endless meetings, and pressures that made him feel that if he took his foot off the accelerator for even a second, everything would fall apart. The emotional cost of this was far greater than he admitted at the time. Howard has shared that during certain periods, he felt so consumed by his projects that he barely noticed time passing. He would come home exhausted, disconnected, trying to make up for his absence with the promise that things will calm down later, a promise he rarely managed to fulfill. Cheryl, in turn, tried to keep the family cohesive, raise the children with stability, and support her husband's dreams, even when that meant giving up a normal routine. This dynamic created silent tensions. Not explosive fights, but a growing perception that something was being sacrificed, that the man she loved was being swallowed by an inhuman rhythm. Ron gradually began to realize that he was drifting away from the things that mattered most, moments with his children, quiet dinners, the simple experience of existing without the constant obligation to deliver results. He felt guilt, but also fear. There was a constant worry that if he said no to a major project, he would lose relevance or disappoint someone, a direct echo of the pressure he had carried since childhood. Fame, which should have been a blessing, sometimes became a heavy shadow. The family couldn't go out for dinner without being observed, photographed, or interrupted. Trips meant for rest turned into implicit commitments. Cheryl endured it with maturity, but both knew that the constant exposure gradually eroded their family balance. There was a critical point, not publicly documented in detail, but mentioned by Ron in more intimate interviews, a moment of exhaustion when he realized he was losing himself. It wasn't just the stressed director or the overloaded professional. It was the husband and father who, even when physically present, felt emotionally absent. It was during this period that he understood he needed to set boundaries, something Hollywood rarely allows. He began turning down certain projects, reorganizing schedules, and dedicating entire periods exclusively to his family. These adjustments were essential not only to save his marriage, but to restore his mental health. With time, he found a delicate balance, built through discipline and awareness. He accepted only the projects that genuinely motivated him, that had something meaningful to say to the world, not just films promising commercial success. Cheryl remained his greatest ally, accompanying him to premieres, supporting professional decisions, and offering the stable environment he had always sought. Together, they raised 4 children who grew up far from scandals, something incredibly rare in Hollywood. Ron Howard spent 5 decades walking through the silent corridors of Hollywood, carrying a burden that few would be able to endure. A burden hidden behind a gentle smile, a controlled voice, and the public image of balance, a character crafted so precisely that even he, for many years, believed it was real. But behind the scenes, far from the cameras, there was another Ron, a Ron consumed by pressures so intense they seemed to slowly devour his identity. The public saw the award-winning director, the beloved actor, the impeccable professional. What he felt, however, was a constant mix of fear, exhaustion, and the suffocating sensation of living a life where any mistake could destroy decades of work. This devastating contrast, the perfect public image versus the chaotic emotional reality, was the true secret that followed him for 50 years. It began in childhood, but it was during adolescence that the secret took shape. Early fame turned him into an icon, but also into a prisoner. He couldn't make mistakes, couldn't complain, couldn't show fatigue. He grew up believing that his presence on set was a favor he owed in return with absolute perfection. And so, with every compliment he received, instead of joy, a shadow appeared, the cruel doubt that he didn't deserve any of it. This insecurity became a permanent voice in his mind, a voice that followed him silently while the public celebrated his performances and producers treated him as a guarantee of success. When he tried to take control of his own career by moving into directing, he expected to finally find creative freedom. But Hollywood, as merciless as ever, quickly showed him another reality. To many executives, he was just the TV kid playing at being a filmmaker. That distrust wounded him deeply, but it also fueled him. The problem was that the fuel didn't come from confidence, but from fear. He said yes to everything, accepted impossible deadlines, revised scripts until dawn, directed under enormous pressure, and rarely took a day off. His body was present, but his mental rest had been hijacked by an invisible force, the constant need to prove his worth. Yet what no one knew, and what became the most controversial point of his entire journey, was how this pressure destroyed his emotional life. Ron Howard, the man admired for his calmness, lived through silent crises, sudden waves of anxiety, sleepless nights, and intrusive thoughts that everything would collapse one day. He hid it from everyone, friends, colleagues, crew, and family. Hollywood is an expert at sweeping fragilities under the rug, and he followed that rule rigorously. The situation grew even more tense when he began working on massive projects filled with commercial expectations and political pressures among major studios. Behind the scenes of some films, he found himself trapped in creative disputes, absurd demands, and suffocating contracts. Meetings became quiet battles, where every word carried weight and every hesitation could be interpreted as incompetence. Meanwhile, the secret, the fear of failing, the fear of disappointing, the fear of not being enough, echoed inside him like constant thunder. Despite all this, the public saw only the bright side: success, awards, partnerships with major names, the meteoric rise of a respected director. It was as if two versions of Ron coexisted, one public and one private, and keeping them separate required emotional labor no one could imagine. The most controversial and rarely mentioned truth is that this internal conflict began to interfere with his personal life. There came a point when, even beside his family, he felt absent, as if he were always mentally preparing for the next demand. His marriage, though strong, was repeatedly tested by the emotional absence caused by relentless pressure. Family life appeared peaceful from the outside, but Ron carried a constant sense of guilt for never being truly present, even when he was physically there. He tried to compensate by working even harder, believing that proving himself professionally would bring him the inner peace he desperately sought. But that peace never came. Every new project brought new challenges, new demands, and a new layer of tension. And then came the darkest period, the moment when Ron realized he was on the verge of losing what he loved most. He found himself exhausted, emotionally drained, fighting to maintain the image of control while feeling internally on the brink of collapse. The secret, being always strong, always productive, always perfect, was consuming him like a slow, silent, but devastating flame. The controversy was not an external scandal, but the fact that Hollywood shaped, nourished, and perpetuated this type of pressure, pushing its artists to the limit while pretending to value them. Ron Howard then did something rare. He faced his own truth. He realized he was being destroyed not by the films nor by the fame, but by the silence, by the fear of admitting that he was human, that he felt, that he suffered, that he doubted. He began speaking about his vulnerabilities in more intimate interviews, admitting the weight of perfectionism, acknowledging that his greatest battle had been internal, not external. It wasn't a confession meant for tabloids or sensationalist headlines. It was a human, liberating admission that dismantled the silent myth of Hollywood perfection. This secret he carried for 50 years, the pressure to be perfect, the fear of failure, the hidden emotional battle, the psychological prison built since childhood, almost destroyed him. But it was by revealing it that he found the strength he had sought all his life. Not the strength of a public image, but the strength of being true. In opening this intimate part of his story, Ron Howard offered the world a narrative as powerful as any film he has ever directed, the courage to admit fragility in an industry that treats fragility as a flaw. At 70 years old, Ron Howard is living a moment of serenity rarely achieved by someone who spent practically his entire life under the spotlight, and this tranquility did not appear by chance. It is the result of decades of self-reflection, confronting pressures accumulated since childhood, and the conscious decision to reorganize his priorities, placing personal life, emotional health, and purpose above the frantic rhythm Hollywood demands. After years juggling film sets, tight deadlines, studio expectations, and the weight of leading massive productions, Ron has finally reached a point of maturity where he can look at his own trajectory with pride, but also with healthy distance. Nothing in his current life happens impulsively. He carefully chooses what he does, who he works with, and which stories he still wants to tell. This creative freedom, earned after decades of consistency and an impeccable reputation, is one of the defining elements of this stage of his life. Today's serenity is also deeply connected to his family. Ron has always made it clear in interviews that his marriage to Cheryl Alley was the anchor that kept him steady during periods of emotional turmoil, and now, after so many years together, they enjoy a routine he describes as simple and precious. Spending time with his now adult children, with his grandchildren, cooking at home, taking unhurried walks, all of that has gained a different, almost sacred value. It is not an attempt to escape the past, but to fully enjoy what for many years he only had in small fragments between one film shoot and another. Regarding work, Ron Howard remains active, but at a far more selective pace. He now approaches new projects with a deeper perspective, always asking himself whether that story truly deserves his energy, time, and emotional attention. It's no longer about numbers, box office results, or proving anything to anyone. It's about meaning. When he chooses to direct something, it's because he genuinely believes that the project can touch people, inspire reflection, or contribute artistically to cinema. This shift in mindset distanced him from unnecessary pressures and brought renewed pleasure to every stage of creation. Today, he speaks openly about how, in the past, he felt obligated to accept everything to avoid disappointing the public or the studios, but now understands that his value isn't measured by the number of projects, but by their quality and the impact they create. Another central aspect of this phase is emotional maturity. Ron has learned to handle criticism better, to recognize his limitations, to delegate, and, most importantly, to accept that he doesn't need to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. He has become someone who generously shares advice, especially with young actors and directors who face the same pressures he once endured. This attitude, he says, is not only a way to give back what he received throughout his career, but also part of his new purpose, making the industry more humane, more welcoming, and less devastating for those just starting out. Ron has also embraced parallel projects that in the past he might not have had the time or courage to pursue. He gives talks, participates in discussions about cinema, writes reflections on creativity, and even gets involved in educational initiatives that encourage children and teenagers to explore the artistic side of life. In all these activities, one element remains constant: the search for meaning. He knows he cannot change what he lived through, but he can transform his experience into something useful for others. His current serenity also comes from having learned to look at the past without blame, without regret, and without fear. He acknowledges the difficulties, mistakes, sacrifices, and even the frustrations he carried in silence, but today he sees all of it as an essential part of the path. Each challenge helps shape the artist, the professional, and above all, the human being he has become. This awareness has given him a lightness that is evident in recent interviews, a calmer gaze, a more genuine smile, a slower and steadier way of speaking. He no longer pressures himself to be perfect or tries to meet impossible expectations. He simply is. And that, he says, is liberating. In summary, the Ron Howard of today is a man who transformed decades of pressure into wisdom, years of non-stop work into purpose, and an entire life surrounded by cameras into a journey of self-understanding. Serene, mature, and self-aware, he now lives guided by a simple yet powerful truth. Nothing is more valuable than the peace one builds after finally understanding what truly matters.